Sick of waiting for your CI tests to pass or having to manage different CI servers for different teams? Using BuildKite, you can run fast and reliable CI pipelines for every type of project, whether it's back-end tests, mobile apps, or even custom hardware. BuildKite's agent helps you scale to thousands of parallel jobs, and your secrets and source code never leave your infrastructure. There's great documentation, a clean web UI, and plugins for different types of tools. Visit BuildKite, that's KITE.com/Hanselman for a 14-day free trial and see how Shopify scaled from 300 to 1,500 engineers while keeping their build times under 5 minutes. That's BuildKite.com/Hanselman. Hi, this is Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today I'm speaking with Dylan Bennett, also known as M. Boffin on the internet. He's an educator and the author of Game Development with the Pico 8. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I am very well. I have been learning all about the Pico 8, and if folks who are listening to this episode might want to go back in time and listen to the episode we did with Joseph White on the Pico 8 Fantasy Console, they can learn even more. But as I started learning about game development, I'm just finding you all over the place. The Portland Indie Game Squad, and on a website called itch.io. What is itch.io?
Itch.io is a publishing site for independent game developers. Makes it really easy for pretty much anyone to publish is whatever they want, and without having to get in the way with things like getting approval by Steam and go through a lot of hoops. And you can fully adjust what percentage goes to Itch versus what percentage goes to the developer, things like that.
That is very clever. So it's not Steam, it's an open marketplace, and it's really for independent creators with the focus, of course, on independent games.
That's right.
So anyone can sell anything up there. It's almost like Etsy for video games.
Yeah. And you can set it up to be a pay what you want. You can hook it up to Patreon, for example, and make certain things, open to patrons or the general public.
Now, I talked about Pico 8, this fantasy console that doesn't exist. You physically can't touch it unless you build your own. Why do Pico 8 game makers find themselves so often on itch.io?
I think it's because it's just so easy. You can go right from making a game, and minutes later you have it published up on a page that has, it's basically its own storefront for that game, really in minutes. That's
amazing. And you also have your game development with Pico 8 stored up there as well. So people can go and buy this 72-page book, effectively. You call it a zine about doing game development. And then you can, like you say, you can pick your price. You recommend, I don't know, I think I paid you $15, but you can also pick nothing if you are a student or someone who can't afford it.
Yeah, I put it up there because I want to make it accessible to anyone. If they would like to contribute, then they're absolutely welcome to. I appreciate your contribution, but I want to make it available for anyone who just wants us. I want to learn how to make games, and this will get you started.
When I go and search for game development, and I've done this with my sons and other young people, I often find myself in places like Unity. And, I love Unity, and I've even had folks from like Mono on my show, but it seemed frankly a little bit overwhelming. Like, it doesn't feel like there's an easy hello world.
I totally agree. That's one of the things that spurred me to make this or make educational tools for game development using Pico 8 was because there's very little setup and ramp up. It's, you get a blank canvas and you can just start typing things in and run it and immediately see something and get something back. There's not a big framework to learn. There's not a lot of, language constructions that you have to learn. You just can kind of sit down and just get started.
It feels though, like as I'm exploring Pico 8, that a lot of people who may be more advanced than my 11-year-old, like to fit things in like a tweet, and it comes off looking like almost like minified code.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to look like that, does it?
No, absolutely not. I mean, that's kind of one of the things about constraints is people like to push a constraint as far as they can. So, when you add Pico 8, which has its own constraints, like 128 pixels by 128 pixels, certain number of, colors, things like that. And then you add on the further constraint of now it has to fit in a tweet. People will really do some amazing things to pack as much as they possibly can into that tiny amount of code space.
Okay, so if I'm getting used to this, or this has been my introduction, and maybe copy pasting from a tweet into the Pico 8 editor is my first introduction to game development, I shouldn't let that slow me down.
Oh yeah, definitely not. These are almost pieces of art in themselves in terms of coding to pack in as much as they can. It's kind of similar to the demo scene that was around for quite a long time in our early days.
Okay. A lot of kids right now are learning JavaScript and learning Python. That seems to be those are the two languages that people jump into when they're in their tweens or in their teens. Do you prefer Pico 8 as a place for a new person to start learning to program as an introduction? Like, let's learn to program. Step 1, Pico 8.
Yes and no. It uses a language called Lua, which is it's a great language, and it's relatively easy to learn and understand what's happening with it. It's not as widely used as, say, Python or JavaScript or other languages like that. But it does allow you to learn the basic fundamentals of what makes programming work. And that, I feel, is more important than the language itself.
Is it full Lua, or is it just the basics? Because when I see games in Pico 8, and as I look through your zine, it's pretty much like variables and tables, which appear to be like late bound objects or late bound hash tables of some kind. And that's basically it. Loops and ifs, and it could be any language.
Yeah, it is a subset of Lua. It's not the full Lua language. And it also has a little bit of extras added in by Joseph in terms of making it more functional for making games, and specifically for Pico 8. So it isn't the full Lua language, but I've had quite a few students who have started off knowing absolutely nothing about programming and ended up loving the subject and going on to do many, many more things just because they were able to get their head around how programming works using this simple system.
I like that your tutorial, and again, this tutorial is available up at itch.io, and I'll make sure that we have links in the show notes. In just 72 pages, you can walk through it in an afternoon on a Saturday or Sunday and just have a real thing running at the end. It builds so quickly, though. You start with, effectively hello world, and by the end, you're moving stuff around. When does it really make the big move? When does the hockey stick begin? Because you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, that's something that I've found is a tough thing, just in terms of teaching coding in general. There's so many fantastic resources for, beginning learning coding. And, they have this really nice, easy, shallow ramp up to learning coding. And some of those materials are absolutely fantastic, like the Hour of Code materials that many, many people have put out. But they kind of leave you at the end of, okay, now what? And let's say you have someone who really enjoyed what they did, with those materials, like learning Scratch or, other Hour of Code materials that are out there. And then now they want to really get into actually making something, in the real world. And
right. Where does non-trivial begin?
Yeah. And what I found is a lot of times there's just this cliff drop off of, okay, now you're in the deep end, go, So what I was trying to do with my tutorial was just trying to give them a little bit of a more realistic intro to what the coding is actually going to be like for making a game. And I found that when I was learning coding years and years ago, I learned by, typing code in that was in these magazines, that, you'd have the 321 Contact magazines would have these, programs in the back that you could type in, and then you'd type it all in, and then you'd run it, and maybe something would be wrong. You go back and fix it, and then you run it, and it does this cool thing. And now you have this program typed in, you can go and tweak it and change it. And I found that was actually more effective for learning how to program than really learning step by step individual things about programming. It was, actually just typing in a bunch of code and then making tweaks and changes, and then continue to make tweaks and changes until you really start to get your head around, this is how this works.
Indeed. In your tutorial, one of the things that I appreciate that you've done is that from around page 28 or page 30, there's like a wall of code, and you say, just type this in, type it in, trust me, it'll be fine. But honestly, other than having a funky font, because if you take a look at Pico 8, it has a very unusual kind of all caps font that can make your eyes blur a little bit.
Yeah.
I think it's only like 25 lines. It's not pages and pages. And I remember in the back of Compute Magazine, writing 3 or 4 pages, and there's not even so much as an explanation.
No, it's just straight up. Yeah, so that was intentional. I didn't want each step to contain more than, a certain amount of code to type in, because I've taught a lot of students, and writing a lot of code can, derail a lot of times. But there is something educational about just typing in code and not just copying and pasting it from one thing, from your tutorial text and pasting it into the editor. There's something actually educational about typing it in yourself, and doing that a lot. But I did want to keep it limited, so you're not just typing in pages and pages.
That is a really good point. I do think that a lot of tutorials do propose that we copy paste from here to there, but you're basically saying the same thing that people say when you take notes during a lecture. Even if you never read the notes again, the act of the kinesthetic act of having it go into your brain, out into your hands, onto a piece of paper, and then back into your eyes, even if it never does that again, has value. Yeah,
it really does. You start to, as you type it in, you start to feel the flow of, this is how, functions are constructed. And you've typed it in enough times, you start to, they're always going to start with this. You always have to make sure you put this at the end, things like that. And you start to develop that, almost like muscle memory about typing code, but also you just start to feel how it all fits together.
Hi, friends. As a programmer, you think in objects. With MongoDB, so does your database. MongoDB is the most popular document-based database built for modern application developers in the cloud era. Millions of developers use MongoDB to power the world's most innovative products and services, from cryptocurrency to online gaming, IoT, and more. You can try MongoDB today with Atlas, the global cloud database service that runs on AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. Configure, deploy, and connect to your database in just a few minutes. Check it out at mongodb.com/atlas. That's mongodb.com/atlas. One of the other things that was interesting to me about Pico 8 and why it was an interesting thing to be chosen is that it feels ancient in that you're writing code in the 80s, and it feels very, very basic. It feels very much kind of like the metal in that you're writing what feels like low-level code.
Right.
But you also have the power of a modern machine, 30 frames a second, or maybe 60 if you insist on it, which then isn't the metal and it isn't ancient. It's incredibly modern. You can do a huge amount of stuff in 60 frames a second.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things I really like about it, especially for teaching, is because you're kind of like, as you said, down, to the metal of it, you have this fast feedback loop where you type in some code and you immediately see what that code does. You can type in a few lines of code and then run it, and right there you see it. And that was something that I felt has been lost a bit. BASIC was fantastic for that, where you could just type in a few lines of code and see what it does. And I don't know if you remember Gorilla.basic from years ago, but I learned so much code from just typing in little pieces and making little tweaks and changes to that basic code and then running it, and then immediately seeing like, oh, wow, all right, this changes the size of the explosions, and then going and finding other things that this changes how fast the banana moves, things like that.
At my company, we call that the developer's inner loop, right? We write for loops and stuff. The inner loop is the make a change, press a button, see the change.
Yeah.
And if you can make the inner loop as little as possible, where, 50 years ago, the inner loop was make a change, go to lunch.
Right.
Yeah. Come back. The inner loop in game development should be as fast as possible. And even ideally, if one could be making the change and having the game never stop running, I think would be idealized.
Yeah. I do remember someone actually did create something like that. But the inner loop in Pico 8 is very short, and I feel that's important for people who are learning programming, because you can see what each change does, and you can feel how it develops as you build it.
Yeah, especially since there's a lot of kind of like low key math involved. In this
Right.
case, it's kind of basic algebra. So if I'm going through creating the Moonlander, the Cave Diver game in your zine, I'm changing X and Y's and sprites and thrusts and kind of physics and whatnot. I want to be able to save and run. And, I think I made a couple of typos, and it was pretty clear, when the lander goes flying off into the corner, that was my bad, not your bad.
Yeah. Now, there's two things that are not realistic about the tutorial that I wrote or the tutorials that are in those zines. One, they don't go concept by concept explaining, and so it doesn't give you an explanation and a full understanding of each concept as it goes. Really, the goal of those tutorials is to, harken back to those days where you just type in a bunch of code and run it and see what happens, and then go tweak stuff. And those, as you mentioned, there'd be pages and pages of code, and you wouldn't know what it does. You just type it in and see what happens. And there is some value to that. So I wanted the tutorials in that zine to reflect that, where you just type in a bunch of code and then run it and see what happens. But there's also another aspect to it that's a bit artificial, which is each step of those tutorials does not go and change previous code. You're just building on what code you've already written. And the original versions of the tutorials that I had tested out with a number of students actually had to go back and change code, because that's often what you actually do when you're really writing code. Is you write something and you'll go back and change it 7, 8, 9, 20, 30 times before you're done. And this one, because it's a tutorial, I found that when students had to go back and change something, that's almost one for one where they went off the rails and got lost, or didn't understand what was happening. And so I built this one where you only are adding on to the code that you've already written, and those difficulties cleared right up. But again, that's not a realistic way that you write code.
Sure, but as an on-ramp, though, always moving forward.
Right.
Makes sense. Like if there's a really great device that I recommend to folks that are teaching kids to code called the Piper, and it's a little Raspberry Pi based machine, and you build it out of wood. So they send you the Pi, screen, and you assemble a laptop effectively, right? Yeah. And the game uses a custom Minecraft engine.
I remember that.
Yeah. It has no keyboard, and you actually can do the whole first tutorial using just the mouse, because you're basically helping a little robot learn to walk. And during that, you actually get a breadboard and you wire up a button, and the first button is to move forward. Literally, it can't move left or right. It can only move forward.
Yeah. And
then in the moving forward, you can then get the ability to turn left or to turn right. It's a similar kind of an idea where there's no modifications. It's right only as you march forward, and you've designed your zine where you have basically the text grayed out that you've already written,
right?
And all they have to do is insert. So it's insert only.
Yeah.
It's a very clever way to teach, and it prevents a lot of potential mistakes. And whether it's realistic or not doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It sets the kids up for success.
Yeah. And, it's very helpful for them to have that feeling of like, oh, I'm like continuing, to add things and move forward. And then it also just makes it easier they're already learning so many other things at the same time, to then muddle up by having to go back and change something that you already created can make it tough.
Exactly. And by kids, I mean full-grown adults like myself.
Exactly.
who enjoy doing this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think is interesting about picking this way to teach people things is with Pico 8, of course, the sprites and the sound effects are built in, and at no time does the learner have to maintain a file.
Right.
I've been having this issue with teaching young people C#. They'll save the file and lose it.
Yeah.
Like I saved it on my desktop, or I saved it in my documents, or it ended up in pictures.
Yeah.
While dealing with sprites and stuff is all kind of integrated. It's a complete IDE, for lack of a better word, for making games.
Yeah. That's another reason I really enjoyed it, is because it is all self-contained. So you're just working in one environment. Everything's all in one.
When you plan your games, and you've made a number of games, and you've done kind of a top-down, you have a larger top-down, how to make a top-down game, do you plan out the sprites ahead of time? Or do you plan, like, where do you start? If I was going to sit down and I've finished your tutorials and now I want to make a game, what do I start at?
The best way that I suggest is to figure out what are the systems you want in your game. And by systems, I mean, what are the very tight pieces of functionality? Like, for instance, do you want the player to move up, down, left, right? Do you want enemies to move around on their own? Do you want them to just move on a track, basically? Do you want to have a scoring system? Things like that. You just decide those simple systems that go into your game. And it can take some time to figure out what those are. But once you have those, then you can start to code those individual systems. Like, for example, okay, you want your player to move. All right, well, code how you want them to move, and then, all right, now I want the enemy to move. Okay, good. Let's, code that in. And I found that breaking it down into the systems first really helps you, because then you know what your game is actually composed of. Also, figuring out what's called the game loop, which is what's the flow of the game. There's a lot of games that feel really complex, but when you break them down, they're actually fairly simple. You're like, for instance, there's lots of arcade games where, the game loop is, destroy enemies, collect pickups, get stronger, defeat a boss. And then that loops around. Destroy enemies. It's like, and it's a tight loop that just consistently, it can get harder and harder and have more types of enemies and more types of pickups and more types of upgrades and bigger and better bosses. But that game loop, is pretty much the same thing the whole time. And if you can figure out what that game loop is, that goes a long way to being able to figure out, okay, how do I want to plan my game? And also understand how much of my game have I done,
That's a really great way to teach kids systems thinking. I did a great podcast on not teaching kids how to code, but teaching people how to think.
Yes.
And like I said, I'm grown, but you're making me go back and think about, like, for example, a game that I played yesterday, called Control, that just came out, where you play a Scarlett Johansson looking redhead who is a secret agent who is also telekinetic. And it's the new hot AAA game of the summer, right? But ultimately, picking up stuff and throwing it at stuff with your mind to blow things up and make explosions is awesome.
Yeah.
And it will sustain you for 15 to 20 hours.
Yeah, that's very true.
Like, it's a whole thing, and there's famous actors and great voiceover work and a huge plot, but ultimately it's picking stuff up with your mind and blowing things up.
Right. Yeah. And that's an effective game loop.
Yeah. Or Zelda. Right? You could go and break it all down. And Zelda and games like it also have subsystems within it that are also fun, like cooking. Yeah,
totally. Yeah, and each of those have their own game loop, and it actually, that translates really well into how you create the games in terms of the code too. It makes it easy to know, like, hey, what does this code do? Oh, this is to handle this part of the game loop.
Interesting. And then once you've figured that out, it's ultimately, I assume it's just like the 80-20 rule, right? It's easy to get 80% of it working in 20% of the time. And then you just tweak the heck out of it till it's truly enjoyable down to the pixel.
Yeah, it really is true.
Interesting. One of the things that I found a little bit confusing was this concept of tables in Pico 8, because it seems to be the one and only and primary data structure.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, when you're teaching that to people, how do you explain it? Tables are kind of unique.
That was actually something I was struggling with when trying to determine, would Pico 8 be a good tool for teaching students to learn how to code? Is how do I deal with tables? Because tables can act like arrays where you have like a numbered list of things, or they can act like, or like a table where each item has like its own name. And really, I realized it comes down to the concept of, it's a collection of things. And that's the simplicity of it. It's a collection of things. And that collection can sometimes be ordered by number, where each item in the collection has its own number, and all, as we all know, as an index, or it can be a name. You can have player.x, player.y, player.speed, player.health, but it could have, it could just be a list of enemies, and it's, the first enemy, the second enemy, the third enemy, fourth enemy. They don't really need identity, So that's how I've effectively, dealt with tables. Is they're collections of variables.
Rather than making folks go through data structures class and learning that it's an array and it's a hash table and it's a list of generic objects and it's a
because those are just different types of collections, maybe more structured or have more rules about how that collection works, but essentially they're just collections.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And do you think that people should go from making a game like this into something larger? Like, could you learn this small and then go and jump into Unity? Would it set you up for success?
I found that if you are learning how to create these systems and learning how that game loop works, and you've got some practice under your belt of consistently making smaller games with these different game loops, it helps quite a bit when you jump into something like Unity, which has a lot more meat and weight behind it, and there's lots more things you have to learn and have to have set up, but it can orient you and keep you grounded into, okay, for Unity, I need to all these things so that I can do this game loop, and there is still the concept of a game loop in Pico 8 as well. You have, a start function, an update function, things like that all are happening as part of the game loop. They're directly translatable from things you learned in Pico 8.
So this might be an ignorant question, but you refer to the game loop, like init, update, draw, repeat.
Yeah.
Would a AAA game somewhere? It does. I guess it has to have a main and it has to have a game loop somewhere.
Yeah. Well, Unity,
that's just simply how it works.
Unity games are built on these fundamental things called game objects, and game objects have a life cycle that very clearly, like when you open a brand new game objects code, the first thing they drop right in without you having to type anything is a start and an update, and the draw is kind of implied, and Unity will handle the draw part for you. But the start and update are right there. Start happens once when the game object begins, and update happens every time it draws to the screen, and that's just, that's how it's doing it. And almost every game I know has that concept built into it. Like a initialization, a start, and then something that kind of moves the game forward.
So in Portland, where you and I are, there's the Portland Indie Game Squad, or PIGSquad.com, right? You're a nonprofit that supports game development. What does that mean, indie game or indie game enthusiasm? What makes us indie? That we don't have a giant corporation telling us what to do?
Yeah, or you don't have a huge corporate structure to support you or to dictate what direction something's going. It's usually smaller groups of people. I mean, some of it's just a single person. Some of it is a small studio of people. And the main thing is that they have their own direction that they can take things, and without having to deal with anything else that goes with having a larger structure, a larger corporation with it.
And when I go up and I look at the picture of using the Indie Game Squad as an example, I see folks of all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds. Are these all gamers that are supporting themselves with indie games, or do they all have day jobs and that this is their hobby and their joy on the side?
It's all over the spectrum. We have people who do this as a hobby. We have people who do this. They've created studios and are doing it as a studio. We do have some people that are part of the AAA community that just kind of want to be able to do their own thing as well. But a lot of times it's just it's a mix. It's a good mix.
And is this something that's unique to Portland, or might there be an Indie Game Squad or something like this in the town or city that the folks who are listening live in?
There are other groups that do similar things to PIGSquad, although from my experience, PIGSquad does seem to be unique in the size at which we do it and the effectiveness at which we have created a really inclusive community for people at all levels of the game development field, whether they're just whether they're just doing it as a hobby or whether they're actually doing it as a full studio. I also noticed that we do have, in terms of inclusivity, we have people who do all aspects of game development. A lot of people think of game development, they think of programmers. But really, that's just one aspect of, dozens of different specializations needed to make a game.
That is a really good point. Like if my son was talking about, he wants to put together he called it an esports league. And he thinks that this is going to be something he could do at his school. But instead, I'm thinking about a way that would bring everyone in his school together, artists and musicians, putting together his own indie game squad at his middle school or his high school.
Yeah.
Might be a way, because you're right. I'm a pretty decent programmer, but the sprites that I've been making are trash.
Yeah.
Let's just be real.
Yep.
So I'm not a Swiss Army knife. I'm just really a lousy pair of scissors.
Yeah. For one thing, having a really good code of conduct that really defines, how we expect people to interact with each other is really important. But presenting ourselves as very welcoming to anyone who's interested in games, whether it's playing games or just making them. We found that we end up creating a community of people that are really willing to go out of their way to help other people and include other people who might be kind of shy about, diving in or not really. There's a lot of imposter syndrome that happens in the field of game development. And that's a very real thing that people have to deal with. And we try to make it as easy as possible for people to break out of that and get past that.
That's a great point. Someone might be a business analyst or an admin in their day job, but they've got a great idea for a game system. They could team up with a programmer who doesn't have any ideas and make a pretty amazing game as a team.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen people who their full-time job was writing code for insurance companies, and now they work with an independent game studio, and that's their full-time job, is making games.
Wow, that's fantastic. So the easy on-ramp could be Pico 8, it could be Unity, but this absolutely happens. When I spoke with Joseph White, the game Celeste, which is an indie game darling, literally started out as a prototype on Pico 8, pushed the limits, and now is a real thing I can buy on my Nintendo Switch or my Xbox.
Yeah, and you can play the original Pico 8 as an Easter egg in the full game. It's really great.
It's embedded in the actual game?
Yeah, there's a little room you can find, and there's a little computer, and if you boot it up, you can play the original Pico 8 version of Celeste inside the now full title of Celeste.
See, that's so cool.
I love that.
That's so wonderful that they did that.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So people can find you by searching for M. Boffin, Boffin, and check out the Pico 8 zine, the PIGSquad, a lot of the great stuff that you've done up on itch.io. I'm going to make sure to include links to all of this stuff in the show notes. What a great way to have a nice, gentle on-ramp into game development. Thanks so much for chatting with me today.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.